Hello, everybody. Welcome to It Came From the Page. And today we're talking about a big topic, and that is trash. What is trash literature? What does it mean to be a piece of art that is quote-unquote considered trash? Now, I have a lot of thoughts on this, essentially just because this is something I've been kind of tackling my entire life, right? The idea of what I'm consuming or what I enjoy to consume is quote-unquote trash. Now, I'm going to make some literary arguments. I'm definitely going to start with an argument from the basis of cinema, because in a lot of ways that is something I'm more well-versed in, let's just say. I have watched a lot more classic cinema. I have watched a lot more cult cinema as well. Like, it's reading to me, I'm going to have some good arguments for reading, hopefully. But I think for cinema, I probably have a better argument. And that's because all of my life, there's one character who I have loved, and that is Godzilla. I love Godzilla, the giant lizard who terrorizes Japan. One of my favorite things in all of existence. I have loved this character since I was very young and never stopped loving this character. In a lot of ways, people have been telling me this is trash my entire life, right? And I have such a fondness for these films, not only as pieces of entertainment, but as pieces of legitimate art. So take for example, the one I'm having right in front of you. This is Gojira, which is the original 1954 film. A lot of people talk about Godzilla just in terms of pop culture osmosis, haven't actually seen the original film. The original film is 100% a piece of cinematic art that is inarguable. It is a treatise all about nuclear weapons and nuclear devastation from the perspective of Japan right after World War II, and in fact, very specific scenarios in this. The Lucky Dragon No. 5 incident, which is something that happened really, really recently to the release of this movie, is directly referenced in it, and the Lucky Dragon No. 5 incident is when the Americans were testing out nuclear bombs and nuclear radiation infected a bunch of Japanese fishermen because they didn't realize what was happening, and they died horrible deaths from nuclear radiation. And that is the opening of this movie is directly referencing that event. Now, there have been a number of sequels, and people will argue about the quality of Godzilla sequels. And I still maintain that I still like them as a piece of art and as a piece of entertainment. I don't see anything hugely differential about that. And one of that is because the director, Ishiro Honda, also directed many of the best Godzilla movies in general and the best Godzilla sequels, which were still directed by Ishiro Honda. And a lot of times in the Japanese film market of the time, you would pretty much be assigned to a studio. So Akira Kurosawa films, who are being made at the same time, are also, the actors also make appearances in Godzilla films. For example, Gojira has Takeshi Shimura in it, and one of the greatest films of all time, inarguably, is Ikiru, which is an Akira Kurosawa film all about a man who finds out he's going to die, and it's a treatise on life and death with a beautiful, beautiful message at the core. And that same actor has appeared in Godzilla films, and a lot of them. And the idea that because he has appeared in both, that suddenly he's trash, right? That suddenly there's some kind of argument that one of these is trash, one of these is art, is always where the thing begins. And for me, it's with Godzilla, Godzilla is a character who destroys dioramas, essentially. Beautiful, beautiful artistic dioramas that if you just, what these Japanese artists created was art. And if you put one of their cityscapes in a museum, you'd be like, oh, that's art. Suddenly a giant monster is destroying that cityscape. Well, now it doesn't matter as much and it's no longer art. That's kind of what happens in a lot of these cases. And also, Ishiro Honda is such a talented director, and he was one of the best friends of Akira Kurosawa. And when Ishiro Honda retired, quote unquote, from filmmaking, he actually became a second unit director for many of Kurosawa's best films, especially in this later period. He was an assistant director on, for example, Ran, which is a beautiful, expansive film by Akira Kurosawa, and Ishiro Honda is the one man he trusted to help him do the second unit photography on that. And now, again, we're talking about different things, but I'm going to kind of wrap this into literature now and kind of talk about movie tie-ins and novelizations in general. Movies get adapted from books all the time. Take Jaws, for example. Jaws is a novel and it's a movie. One of the best movies of all time. One of it's not a bad novel. A better than average novel. But one of the best movies of all time. One of the best cinematic blockbusters of all time. Now, is that trash now? Because it's not based off just being its own thing. It's an adaptation of something else. A lot of arguments I find against novelizations, if you try to expand that argument past the existence of novelizations, I don't think they hold up that hardcore, because adaptation does not equal trash, just in general. Like, I don't think that adapting something and using the adaptation of a name, right? Because Peter Benchley's Jaws was a best-selling book that got adapted into a movie. There was name recognition from that title if you had read the book. So that's kind of the argument people make in regards to novelizations, where people go, oh, they're created off of something else, there's name recognition, therefore they're quote-unquote more trashy. Well, so one of the examples is Dean Koontz' The Funhouse. I'm not here to argue anything about Dean Koontz. I'm not here to argue the quality of this book, merely to talk about the cultural cachet of Dean Koontz. As you can see, really, really small lettering, it says it was published under a pseudonym originally. But other than that, you don't actually get the idea that this is a novelization. This is a novelization of the movie The Funhouse, which is a Tobe Hooper movie. You don't get that from this cover. This was reprinted years after The Funhouse got made, years after that novelization has been made. It was reprinted to kind of go off of the name of Dean Koontz. But if you were just in a supermarket, you didn't know anything about the movie The Funhouse, which is not a huge movie, but you knew about Dean Koontz, you would pick up this book, you would read it, and you go, oh, this is either a good or bad Dean Koontz novel. No basis for judging this as part of being a movie, because this is Dean Koontz adapting a screenplay. Another thing I think people don't realize when they're talking about novelizations is almost always novelizations are made from the script level, not from the finished picture level. So they're not actually... So when a novelist is doing a novelization, they're working under a script. A lot of times they haven't seen the movie. A lot of times it's done to be coincided with the movie's release. So they don't get extra information. They just get a script. It's important historically, and as in a lot of cases, novelizations are based off of earlier iterations of a script, and therefore do have some cultural value in the fact of, this is not the same story, this is a different story. For example, we were talking about Jaws. Jaws 2. The novel is based off of an earlier script for the original sequel to Jaws, which is a much darker story. And it has cachet in being like, if you're a film historian and you want to read what was the original idea for Jaws 2, that's important. But also, you can just read this book and not see the movie and still get something out of it. A good writer can make a good novelization. For example, I recently read Blue Sunshine by Ken Johnson. I've never actually seen the movie. There was no issues reading this book. In fact, I don't think reading this book was any different than reading any other book. It's either a good book or a bad book, but I don't think that the fact of it being a novelization all of a sudden pushes it into being something that is less than. This is just an 80s horror books. That does enter a portion of the video where I do have to address the fact that just being a fan of horror in general, you're already in a losing fight. You can be the greatest horror book ever written, and unless someone reviews it highly, and then you become a thriller. Almost always horror is stuck in just this is horror, this belongs in the trash, after a certain point. A lot of classic horror makes it into like Penguin Publishing and Penguin reprints. But once you reach to a certain point, say like the 70s and the 80s, once you kind of hit that point, if you were writing horror, you were seen as quote-unquote less than. And this is a debate that happens all of the time, especially when it comes to horror movies, in that so many people from a certain era, when you read a lot of history books, so I read a lot of like history of slasher books just to learn about horror filmmaking in general from a certain time period. Usually those making of books have a very specific chapter based off of a Ebert and Siskel episode where they pretty much trash all of the slasher films in general and just call them out and out trash, misogynist, and like all of this stuff. Half of the movies they reference in there, I have read amazing pieces by women talking about their own experiences and talking about what they have gotten out of those materials that are quote unquote trash. For example, I picked up this zine. Haven't read this yet, but I just thought that this would be a really good zine to kind of point out what I'm kind of talking about. The Final Girl, How Horror Movies Made Me a Better Feminist. This is a kind of material that is a critical examination of pieces of art that are just instantly considered trash without being given their full due. And I think horror gets that a lot as just a genre in general. I would say go to whatever streaming service you want to go to. Say Amazon. I find Amazon Prime streaming services. You can find adventure films, you can find comedy films, you can find tons of thrillers. You don't find anything under the designation of horror. Even on Disney Plus, who in Canada, Disney Plus has a huge array of R-rated films just because we don't have Hulu or Stars, and they wrote that all into Disney Plus just as it is. Disney Plus does not have a horror section, but it has tons of horror movies on the service. And the reason why they don't have a horror section is because horror is still treated like garbage. Horror movies always make money, and they are always treated kind of trashy and less than by most communities, by most critical communities. And I do feel like that definitely goes into the literary genre and the literary space. In that, novelizations, okay, they're trash now. Horror as a genre gets a little bit more respect in literature just because you have those bases of like, oh yeah, Frankenstein and like all of these like classic Gothic literatures have made it to the point of where they're older enough to be considered respectable. Penguin reprints of those books, but you won't like see them of horror books written in the 80s. For example, one of the best horror books I've ever read is The Auctioneer by Joan Sampson, and that is a fantastic book, but it's roped in with all those other horror books just because it's a horror book released in this specific era. And it was one of those things where a lot of people it's never going to get a Penguin reprint, even though I think it deserves it. And I think that, it's all kind of, this level, there's all levels of respectability. I'm not trying to say you're wrong for thinking this way. I just think that a lot of these things are not hard and fast rules. There are good novelizations, there are bad novelizations. There are good tie-in books, there are bad tie-in books, right? And for example, there's like one of the, going off of Criminology's video, which is kind of what kind of inspired me to do this, is one of the things is it based upon a video game? Now, I went to my collection and was like looking at, do I have any of that? And I have this novelization of Resident Evil City of the Dead by S.D. Perry. Now, again, I have not read this book. As you can see, it's got a pretty clean spine on there. I'm planning on reading it. But one of the things I want to point out with this book, though, is that S.D. Perry is a woman. So that's a female writer talking about a horror story that was, and adapting a horror story that was predominantly told through a male lens. Because a lot of classic horror video games, especially if they're coming out of Japan, which unfortunately has a very misogynist hierarchy as far as a lot of their upper business levels, in terms of the creatives and their business levels do. A lot of times you don't get female perspectives from these stories, even though they feature a lot of female characters. So the idea that you can use the cachet, quote unquote cachet, of using the title of Resident Evil to allow a story to be told through a different lens than what you've been seeing before is, I think, valuable. And I don't think that this just automatically qualifies it as trash. I think that this makes it a book to be read and to be examined and to see if it's good or not. It could be a bad book. I'm not saying that this makes it a good book. I'm saying that this makes it worthy to be considered the possibility of being a good book, rather than just going like, oh, this is trash all told just because it's based on City of the Dead. I think a lot of this can be found if you go through film. Again, switching back to film, there are a number of blaxploitation films from the 70s featuring actors who are Shakespearean level actors. Think about Blackula, which the title alone, certainly puts it into that exploitation zone. But if you watch a movie like Horror Noir, which is this beautiful documentary all about the history of black horror films, it's really, really good. I really recommend you watch it. It's on Shudder. If you have access to Shudder at all, Horror Noir is a must-watch. But they talk about how a lot of times blaxploitation films have worth. A lot of these movies are really, really good, and that's because these are the only chances these actors who are doing Shakespearean levels performances on the stage. Think of Thalmus Rasulullah from Blackula, William Marshall. These actors are great actors, but the only things that they're able to do in this period is something like blaxploitation because of how racist the studio system was. So a lot of times you get openings for people who have great acting abilities, great storytelling abilities, but they have been roped into a very specific genre because that's the only way that they could get work. And that doesn't make their performances trash. There's some really great performances in Blackula. I think Blackula has some great performances in it. And I just think that there is like a level of disconnect people have where just because something is written under an exploitation lens, exploitation does not equal trash, in my opinion. I think that there is a lot to talk about in that regard. Moving to television and more tie-in stuff in general. So, for example, let's talk about Star Trek, the original Star Trek show from the 1960s. Some of the best episodes of that show were written by novelists. So think about The City on the Edge of Forever, which is one of the best Star Trek episodes of all time. A really great episode of art. I think it's a fantastic episode of television. I really, really love it. I find it very moving. And it was written by Harlan Ellison. Harlan Ellison did do a lot of TV work, but he also did a whole bunch of novel work. So you have a novelist coming in to write an episode of television, and it's really, really good. What makes that different than somebody coming into a established series of books and writing a really great book in that established universe? I don't think there is much difference at all. I think it's just a different medium. But you could just watch that Star Trek episode and be like, damn, that's a good episode. That's a great story being told. I can read, for example, Aliens. I love the Alien franchise. I can read Alien the Cold Forge, which is a book by Alex White. They are a non-binary author who wrote an amazing book that deals all about like gender identity, transhumanism, all these very complex themes and very great elements being explored through a media tie-in book. And really, that's like, to me, that's like the City on the Edge of Forever of books. So it's this great book that exists in this pre-established series, but the book is great, and you could read that book without having any other experience with Alien and go, damn, that's a good book. I just don't see, like, all of a sudden, if a novelist can go to Star Trek and write a great episode of Star Trek, why should all of a sudden me picking up this book by J.M. Dillard all of a sudden make me go, oh, this is going to be trash? Well, no. Maybe this is just a really great story. Haven't read it yet. I plan to read it, but I'm just using that as an example of me picking this up, going like, maybe this isn't trash. Maybe this is just a great piece of art. I don't know. Who knows? I don't know. I recently read a Joe R. Lansdale story, which is a Batman tie-in book, and this book affected me emotionally. I left this book feeling emotional and feeling hopeful. Like, I had a very a very enthusiastic response to this story. And just because Joe R. Lansdale wrote this book does not make all of Joe R. Lansdale's other work less than. One of the things that Criminology was talking about is if they're an author who has done a whole bunch of novelizations, then maybe their book classifies as trash. To which that for me makes me instantly think of Alan Dean Foster, who is one of the most prolific novelization authors of all time. But I don't think that makes Alan Dean Foster's non-novelization work trash. I'm sure some of it is really good. I have a lot of his books that I just picked up because I'm interested in reading his writing style, and I think the writing style in his novelizations is good. Like, I think Alan Dean Foster is a good writer who just wrote a bunch of novelizations. I don't know. Again, I'm not trying to, like, combat. Boom, 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 boom. No combating. I'm not trying to be like, you're wrong and I'm right. I'm just trying to put my foot into the discussion with people who are definitely smarter than I am. I'm going to say, when it comes to literature, all the other people who made videos on this are much smarter than I am. This is only my personal take, and I just thought that it would be an interesting discussion to have, to kind of go into this. And for me, one of the things that I'm kind of hoping with Garb August is that all these people like pick up these books and go, oh, this is going to be trash, this is going to be trash. And they read the book and they go, oh, that was a good book. I like that book a lot. And all of a sudden you go, maybe we've been judging some of these material a little too harshly. I don't know. What do you guys think? Obviously, I'm excited for, Garb August. I use the word trash a lot as like a defense mechanism. So usually when I talk about a trashy book, it's mostly like, you can't insult me if I read trash, right? If I go, someone asks, hey, what are you reading? I'm like, I'm just reading this trash. And they can't insult me anymore because I said I'm reading trash. I'm like it's my defense mechanism. So if you ever see me doing that, I'm probably more of like using a defense mechanism. But the reality of it, I think it's a more complex topic to have. And also, one of the things about Criminology's video is he's saying that this is not a hard and fast rule. These are just some rules you can look into to try and create the debate and create the discussion about what you consider trash and how you're going to do it. So a lot of these videos, I really recommend you watch these videos. I'll probably link to them all in the show notes. And I'm by no means saying anyone's wrong. I'm merely just trying to enter a discussion to talk about things that are unloved and that I love. And I have been dealing with that for a very long time in my life. So I would love to hear what you think about this. I will be doing the Cosmic Horror wrap-up on Tuesday. I was going to do that today, but I got emotional and had to record this video. Anyways, thank you, and have a great day. Bye!